January 5th, 1943, Iron Bottom Sound, A Shell with a Secret. January 5th, 1943, off Guadalcanal, the black waters of Iron Bottom Sound, where the sea still feels haunted by the ships already lost here. USS Helena, CL-50, cuts through a low, humid night, her decks slick with salt and spray, her silhouette barely a darker stain against the darker Pacific. The air tastes of fuel oil and cordite from earlier firing, and every man aboard knows the rhythm of this place. You work, you listen, you wait for the sky to suddenly turn hostile. Near a 5-inch dual-purpose mount, a gun captain crouches under a hooded battle lamp, hands steady on metal that sweats in the heat, while somewhere above him, the Mk-37 director and radar operators strain for the first hint of an incoming raid. The call comes sharp and ugly, air contact, followed by the kind of alarm that makes your spine tighten before your mind catches up. Japanese aircraft closing, low and fast, using darkness and distance like armor. The gun crew's world shrinks to commands and muscle memory. Load! Stand by. But tonight, there's an extra layer. Something whispered and guarded like contraband. Special fuses. Not timed, not impact. A new kind of variable time that no one is supposed to talk about. Because if one dud washes ashore in enemy hands, the miracle dies before it can save anyone else. A petty officer produces the rounds with an almost superstitious care, and the men can feel the significance without fully understanding the electronics buried inside. Tiny, shock-hardened, designed to sense when the shell passes near an aircraft and detonate in the air where fragments can scythe through aluminum and fuel. When the order finally comes to use them, it lands like permission to break a rule. The crew rams the 5-inch shell home, slams the breech, and the mount elevates with a smooth, predatory lift as the director calls the aim. The sky is still mostly empty to the naked eye, just a wet darkness and faint stars, until shapes begin to form, distant engine notes, then brief glints as aircraft cross a lighter patch of cloud. The first salvo cracks out and the ship shudders, muzzle blast flashing white and then vanishing, and everyone waits for the old disappointment, shells bursting too early, too late, harmless fireworks. Instead, ahead and above, a burst blooms at just the wrong place for the attacker and the right place for the defenders. Close, sharp, violent, as if the air itself has been struck with a hammer. Another follows, and the spacing feels different, less like guessing, more like the ship is reaching up and tearing at the planes with invisible hands. Men on the gun deck don't cheer. They work faster, eyes wide, because you can sense it when the odds shift. This is not just better gunnery. This is a new kind of protection being born in combat. And on this night near Guadalcanal, Helena is proving it with real explosions in real sky. The target is still a smear of darkness against darker cloud. When Helena's fire control finally locks into a rhythm, the Mk-37 director feeding the mounts with numbers that feel like a lifeline, bearing, range, elevation, while the deck crews move as one body, powder and projectile handled with the fast, almost gentle precision of men who know a single fumble can cost a ship. Aft, near the 5-inch mounts, Lieutenant Red Cochran, battery officer, calm voice in a world of shouting, watches his team with a hard focus that isn't fear so much as calculation. The talk about these VT fuses has been half rumor, half religion, and now the rumor is sitting in the breach like a sealed promise. Somewhere on the ship, a senior observer is present to witness and verify what happens next, because the Navy doesn't trust miracles without receipts, and this miracle is too valuable to waste on wishful thinking. The aircraft closes fast, an Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber shape, low and aggressive, the kind that has already killed enough ships in these waters to make every sailor's mouth go dry, and for a moment the old familiar terror rises. You can hit the plane only if your shell bursts at the right place, and right place is usually a matter of luck or perfect timing in the chaos of speed and wind and evasive maneuvers. Commence firing, comes the order, and the aft 5-inch 38s answer with a triple crack that slams through the ship. The recoil shudders up through steel, the muzzle blast flashes, and the shells claw into the night. The crew's eyes chase nothing. At this range, you don't see the projectiles. You only see the sky, until, ahead of the attacker, a burst snaps open with a violence that feels different. Not a distant firework, but a close, sharp airburst, right where a moving airplane can't ignore it. The second salvo follows, and now the bursts aren't just near, they're menacingly near, a constellation of fragmentation right in the path the dive bomber wants to take. You can almost sense the aircraft flinch, its smooth approach suddenly spoiled, because metal in the air is the one thing a pilot can't outturn at the last second. The Val wobbles, slips, loses the confident line of attack, and in that wobble, the crew on Helena feels the shift in the universe. Their shells are no longer begging for perfect timing. The fuses are doing the last, impossible step themselves, detonating when the target is close enough to be cut. Men keep loading, because you don't stop to admire a breakthrough when an enemy airplane is still alive, but the gun captain's eyes are wide now, not with wonder, but with a hard, dawning certainty. This is what it looks like when anti-aircraft fire becomes a blade instead of a warning. The sky ahead flashes again, and the attacker's outline stutters. Pieces, sparks, a brief, ugly loss of control. Then it's gone into the night, falling away, and the deck crews keep working for the next silhouette because Guadalcanal doesn't allow you to savor anything for long. Yet under all the shouted commands and hot casing clatter, a quiet thought spreads from mount to mount. If this works consistently, then the air above the fleet has just become far more dangerous for anyone who comes in to kill. The night doesn't pause to confirm what everyone wants to believe. It keeps moving, wet and hostile, and Helena's gunners swing their barrels again as another engine note crawls across the darkness, because one damaged attacker doesn't mean the raid is over. The director calls new bearings, the mounts elevate, and the crew loads as if the last burst never happened, because in combat, you treat every second like a debt. But the observers on board are already doing the other kind of fighting. The paperwork fight, the truth fight, the one that turns a "we think we got him" into a verified combat success that will justify risking the most secret fuse in the US arsenal. Somewhere near the plotting space, a voice is clipped and careful. Record time, range, salvo count, burst pattern, pilot reactions, any sign of debris or splash, because the VT fuse isn't supposed to be a rumor anymore. It's supposed to be a weapon you can trust. And trust is expensive. The officers who authorized using those rounds are feeling the weight of the decision in a way the gun crews can't fully see. Every shell that leaves the muzzle carries a tiny radio-based brain, shock-hardened, sealed, astonishingly delicate for something fired from a gun. And if even one fails to detonate and drops into the sea intact, it might drift into enemy hands, and the advantage could vanish. That's why the instructions are harsh and almost paranoid. Don't fire unless the odds justify it. If there's a chance of a dud splashing down close to shore, think twice. If the situation allows, recover fragments, record anomalies, and above all, treat every round like classified material. So, while the aft battery keeps firing at shadows, another drama plays out in the minds of the officers. Did the bursts happen close enough to the aircraft to confirm the fuse function, or did they simply look good? A shell with a mechanical time fuse can burst in the right-looking place by accident. The Navy needs more than luck. It needs proof that the round sensed the aircraft's presence and detonated at lethal proximity. The men who witnessed the engagement watch the sky for the telltale signs, an airburst that tracks the target's movement, not a fixed point, a sudden disintegration in the aircraft's path, a break in the attack that corresponds to burst timing. On deck, sailors point into the darkness and swear they saw sparks, a falling shape, a brief flash low on the horizon like something hitting the water hard, and that may be enough for the official note. Probable becomes verified only when corroborated by multiple eyes and instruments. In the gun mount, the crew doesn't talk about electronics or secrecy. They talk about what they can feel. The difference between shells that explode somewhere out there and shells that seem to reach into the air and punish a plane for getting close. The gun captain wipes sweat from his brow and tastes cordite, hearing the dull clank of the breech and the shouted cadence that keeps men alive. He also hears, faintly, the change in the ship's mood. Less resignation, more aggression. Because when you believe your fire can actually stop an attacker before it releases, you stand your ground differently. And above them all hangs a quiet, guarded understanding. Tonight isn't just another Guadalcanal air raid. Tonight is a test of a secret fuse that might one day decide whether a ship lives or dies when aircraft come in too fast to miss. The immediate danger finally thins into distance, the engine notes fade, the last nervous bursts of fire die out, and Helena settles back into that tense post-action quiet where men can suddenly hear the ship again. Ventilation fans humming, seawater slapping the hull, a casing rolling in a corner until a sailor kicks it still. On the 5-inch mount, the crew's hands keep moving even after the firing stops, wiping down metal, checking the recoil system, stacking ready-use rounds, because adrenaline doesn't shut off neatly. It leaks away in tremors and dry mouths. Somebody tries to speak casually, to make it just another raid, but the gun captain's eyes keep drifting to the special ammunition rack with a look that's half awe, half suspicion, as if the shells themselves are dangerous beyond their explosives. No one says proximity out loud, not in clear language, not on an open deck in a war zone where you assume the enemy is always listening. The talk stays coded. Those new fuses, the special ones, the rounds that burst right on them. And when a young loader asks what's inside them, an older petty officer shuts him down with a glare that feels heavier than rank. Below decks, in a small compartment where officers can speak without the wind stealing words, the tone is different. Less excitement, more controlled urgency. Logs are laid out, times marked, estimates compared, which mount fired first, what the director called, how close the bursts appeared to the aircraft, whether the attacker broke off before it could commit, and whether any detonation looked like it tracked the target, rather than simply bursting somewhere along a predicted path. An officer warns them bluntly. If a shell doesn't function and splashes intact, it's not just a dud, it's a gift to the enemy. The order is repeated in the harshest possible terms. Report any suspected malfunction and keep the facts tight, because the value of this weapon isn't only that it kills aircraft, it's that the enemy doesn't understand why aircraft suddenly die in midair. On the bridge, the captain receives a terse update, then another, and his response isn't celebration, but the kind of careful satisfaction that stays behind the eyes. He knows every AA officer in the South Pacific has been begging for something that can turn near misses into kills, something that can punish a fast-moving plane without asking a human to set an exact burst time in the chaos of combat. Now, in the humid darkness off Guadalcanal, he has a hint that it's real, and that hint must be protected. Orders go out to keep chatter disciplined, to treat the engagement as routine in outward communications, while in sealed reports, the details are written with clinical care and sent up the chain to men who can make a strategic decision, whether this tiny miracle is ready to be trusted more widely. On the gun deck, the sailors don't see those cables or sealed envelopes. They only feel the aftertaste of the fight and the unsettling thought that the ship has just fired something smarter than anything they've ever loaded before. The Pacific night remains dangerous, and everyone knows another raid can come before dawn, but a new confidence has taken root. Not bravado, not relief, but the sense that if the enemy returns, Helena's shells won't just explode in the general direction of the threat, they'll reach up and bite. Word travels in a navy the way heat travels through steel, slow at first, then everywhere. And even when the details are classified, the feeling of a new weapon spreads. Gunners on other ships hear that Helena's 5-inch battery got one with those special rounds, that the bursts were unnaturally close, that an attacker broke apart in the air instead of limping away, and the rumor becomes a kind of pressure that climbs the chain of command. But pressure isn't policy. Policy comes from proof. and proof comes from reports written in careful language, stamped, sealed, and carried like contraband, to officers who understand that the VT fuse is not just ammunition, it's a strategic secret built out of physics and fragility. In the weeks that follow, the Navy's handling of VT is almost obsessive. Distribution restricted, firing rules strict, storage watched, and after-action reports studied like scripture because the fuse's greatest strength, its ability to detonate at lethal proximity without perfect timing, also creates new fears. Could salt air degrade it? Could gunshock ruin it? Could tropical storage cause failures? Could a single intact dud be recovered by the Japanese and analyzed? So the fleet tests it in war, cautiously, in small doses, using it when the threat justifies the risk and documenting everything when it does. And every time an airburst blossoms close to a plane and the plane visibly falters, the weapon's credibility hardens. Gun crews begin to notice patterns. With conventional time fuses, you see bursts that might be close. With VT, you see bursts that look like they're tied to the aircraft's movement, like a net tightening at the exact wrong moment for the attacker. That changes behavior. Directors track more aggressively because they know the last step is no longer a human guess. Mount crews load faster because the payoff is higher. Even the sound of the bursts feels different in the mind. Less like distant fireworks, more like a punch thrown into the sky. In briefings, officers start speaking about effective range in a new way, not just about where the shell can reach, but where it can kill with a near miss. And in shipboard routines, confidence starts to replace fatalism. Because the worst part of early war AA defense was the sense that you were always a fraction too late, always watching a bomber or torpedo plane survive your barrage long enough to drop and kill you anyway. Now the doctrine begins to tilt. Build a wall of bursting steel in front of the attacker and let the fuse do the timing at the last instant. Yet every step forward is paired with secrecy discipline. No bragging signals, no casual talk in letters home, no mention in unclassified logs. Because if the Japanese realize the Americans have a proximity fuse, they'll respond with tactics, altitude changes, jamming attempts, or sheer caution. And the weapon's suddenness is part of its lethality. So the Navy's new airburst power grows in the shadows. Gunners learning by doing, officers learning by reports, the technology spreading ship to ship as confidence grows and the war demands faster adaptation. Off Guadalcanal, the sea remains a killing ground, but a quiet evolution is underway, one that turns anti-aircraft guns from loud deterrents into true scythes, capable of cutting down an attacker not with perfect aim, but with a lethal near. What makes the VT fuse feel like a miracle to the men who fire it is that it behaves like a mind at the tip of a shell, and the Navy treats it accordingly, less like ammunition, more like a classified instrument that happens to explode. In the humid compartments where ready-use lockers sweat and paint smells like old solvent, ordnance crews handle the rounds with a careful, almost priestly routine. Seals checked, packaging accounted for, serial numbers noted, and strict orders repeated until they become reflex. If a round fails to function, report it immediately. If there's any chance it could be recovered, do everything possible to prevent that. Do not discuss it in plain language where a loose ear or a captured diary could carry the secret to the enemy. The reason is simple and terrifying. Inside that fuse is a miniature radio set, shock-hardened electronics, a tiny transmitter and receiver that listens for the echo of its own signal bouncing off an aircraft, then triggers the burst when the echo grows strong enough. It's engineering that feels impossible in a world of rivets and steam, and it works only because thousands of delicate decisions were forced into something that can survive being fired from a 5-inch gun. But delicacy and war do not like each other. Officers worry about everything: batteries draining in tropical heat, circuits failing under acceleration, salt air creeping into seals, and the single nightmare scenario that keeps returning like a bad dream: an intact dud, floating or buried, picked up by the Japanese and handed to their technicians. So the fleet's first months with VT become a balancing act between survival and secrecy. Gunners want it now, always, because they've seen what it can do. Commanders ration it because using it too freely increases the chance of losing one. In quiet briefings, the language is clipped. VT rounds are authorized for genuine air threats at certain ranges, especially when the target is fast and low and the ship's margin is thin. Do not waste them on distant, maybe contacts. Do not fire them where they might land on beaches or reefs close to enemy-held shore. Every man understands the logic, even if he hates it, because a secret weapon only changes the war if it stays secret long enough to be used again. Back on Helena, the men who witnessed that early success off Guadalcanal feel a strange, uneasy pride. They were there when the weapon proved itself, but they're also told, implicitly and explicitly, that they must carry the memory like a locked box. They go back to watches, drills, and the constant Pacific routine of sweat and vigilance, while higher headquarters turns their combat report into a lever. It becomes part of the argument that this technology isn't just a laboratory trick, it's reliable enough to stake ships on. And as more engagements accumulate, more close airbursts, more broken attacks, more aircraft that don't make it through, VT begins to change the tone of the fleet's defenses. It doesn't make men fearless, but it gives them something they can believe in. That a near miss can finally count, that the sky can be cut with steel, that the attacker's last seconds can be stolen by a fuse that thinks faster than a human can time. Yet the paranoia never leaves, because the miracle is small and fragile and worth more than any single kill. And the men who carry it know that the Pacific isn't only a battlefield of guns and planes, it's a battlefield of secrets, where one recovered piece of metal can erase an advantage bought with years of science and paid for in the lives of ships. In war, belief is never enough. The Navy wants numbers, confirmations, and patterns that can survive scrutiny, because a weapon this secret cannot be adopted on faith alone. After the engagement, Helena's officers go back through every fragment of evidence the night offered. Director plots, radar bearings, gun logs, witness statements, trying to reconstruct the geometry of the airburst, where the shell detonated relative to the aircraft, whether the bursts clustered in a way consistent with proximity sensing, and whether the attacker's behavior changed immediately after the bursts. The gunner's accounts are vivid. Burst right in front of him, saw sparks, plane wobbled hard, but vivid doesn't equal verified, so the ship's leadership treats the story like a case file. If there was a splash, where was it? If there was a falling shape, did anyone else see it? Did any tracer from the plane's own guns stop abruptly? Did the sound of engines change, smooth to ragged, right after the burst? In the South Pacific's chaotic night environment, certainty is rare, but the point is to build a chain strong enough that the ordnance men in Washington and the fleet staff in the theater can say, without flinching, the fuse worked as designed, in combat, under the worst conditions. And as more ships begin using VT in similar engagements, the pattern that matters most starts to emerge. Fewer near-miss barrages that look impressive and do little, and more bursts that actually disrupt attacks. Planes breaking off, losing wings, stalling into the sea, or simply failing to press in close enough to release accurately. That disruption is as valuable as a kill, because in naval air defense, an attacker doesn't have to be destroyed to be neutralized. He only has to be forced to miss. Reports from multiple ships begin to echo the same language, carefully phrased but emotionally unmistakable. Airburst effective. Attack broken. Possible aircraft destroyed. Each report adds weight to the argument that VT is not a one-night fluke. That matters because the Navy is staring down an enemy that learns fast. And every month that passes brings new forms of air threat. Torpedo planes, dive bombers, skip bombers, and eventually, later in the war, the kind of attacker that doesn't intend to survive the run at all. The idea that a shell can detonate at lethal proximity without perfect timing is not just helpful, it's transformational. Yet even as confidence grows, the secrecy discipline tightens. Reports are classified, details restricted, and the story is kept away from casual ears, because the best proof you can produce is also the greatest temptation to boast. On Helena, the gun captain learns to live with that contradiction. He can feel in his bones that his crew did something historic, but he must speak about it as routine gunnery. He drills his men again, correcting small errors, pushing speed, because now he knows the ship has a new edge, and the edge is only useful if the crew can put it into the sky on time. Out on the water, the same truth spreads through the fleet, not as a slogan, but as a changed posture. When the next air contact call comes, men move with a different kind of urgency, because they've seen that the sky can be punished not only by direct hits, but by the lethal mathematics of being near. The months roll forward, and the VT fuse spreads through the fleet the way a storm front spreads, quietly at first, then suddenly everywhere, carried in locked containers, guarded by paperwork, and introduced to gun crews with the same clipped warning every time. Treat it like a weapon and a secret at once. By 1944, the war has moved far beyond Guadalcanal's damp darkness into wider seas and larger formations, fast carrier task forces, dense screens of destroyers, cruisers bristling with 5-inch 38 mounts, all of them living under the same fear that a single aircraft, low and fast, can still punch through and set a carrier burning. On a bright day at sea, when the horizon looks harmless and the sun turns the water into a blinding sheet of steel, a destroyer in the screen hears the same words Helena heard a year earlier. Air contact. Except now the sky is full of them. Raids building at range, multiple groups, and the old defenses feel too small for the scale. In the director, men track targets with steady hands. In the mounts, crews slam shells home with practiced violence. And somewhere in the ready lockers, the special rounds sit among the ordinary ones like loaded promises. When the order comes, VT authorized, there is no ceremony, only speed. The breach closes, the mount elevates, and the first bursts appear ahead of the incoming aircraft, hanging in the air like snapped whips. The difference is immediate and unmistakable to anyone who has ever watched conventional AA fail by inches. The bursts are not politely distant. They bloom right where the attacker must fly, and the formation begins to deform under pressure. Planes jinking early, losing their clean approach, some breaking away before they can commit. Sailors on deck don't see technology, they see results. An aircraft suddenly shedding parts, a wing tipping wrong, a plunge into the sea that leaves only a white scar of foam, and the ship's whole posture changes, because what once felt like praying for direct hits now feels like building a wall you can actually believe in. Yet even as the miracle becomes routine, the paranoia stays welded to it. Officers watch the sea after each engagement for any sign of an intact splash, any hint a dud might drift toward enemy-held water. Messages are still coded, reports still sealed, and men still warned that the enemy must never understand why their aircraft are dying before they reach release range. Then the war takes its darkest turn in the air, attacks where the pilot doesn't plan to return. When kamikaze tactics appear, the fleet's problem becomes brutally simple. You don't just have to discourage an attacker, you have to break him fast, because a plane that hits is a bomb by definition. And that is where the tiny miracle born near Guadalcanal reveals its full meaning. Against a suicide dive, perfect timing is almost impossible. Seconds decide everything. Yet VT makes seconds count by stealing them from the attacker. Detonations close enough to shred control surfaces, punch coolant lines, ignite fuel, or simply hammer the airframe so violently that the dive wobbles into a miss. Men who survive these runs rarely describe it as science. They describe it as a sudden, savage series of airbursts that seem to reach out and tear the plane apart in front of them, giving the ship one more breath of distance, one more chance to live. And in the quiet after an engagement, when smoke drifts away and crews look at each other with that stunned, grateful exhaustion. Some old sailor will mention, almost under his breath, that this all started with a handful of verified bursts in the South Pacific, on a cruiser named Helena, on a night when the Navy learned it could make the sky itself explode at the exact moment it mattered. No advantage remains unchallenged in this war, but VT's brilliance is that it doesn't need to stay invisible forever to be useful. It only needs to stay unexplained long enough to break the enemy's confidence and protect the fleet while the war's tempo accelerates. Japanese aircrews begin to notice the change in the sky in the only way pilots can, by watching planes beside them suddenly vanish in midair without a clean tracer line or a direct flak hit, by feeling bursts that are too close, too perfectly placed, by seeing aluminum rip and fuel mist flash where, by old experience, a near miss should have been survivable. They report heavy flak, new bursts, intense airbursts, and some try to adapt instinctively, steeper approaches, lower runs, jinking earlier, spreading formations. Yet adaptation is difficult when you don't understand the mechanism. It's like trying to dodge a blade you can't see. On the Allied side, commanders understand the temptation that comes with a weapon this effective. You want to use it everywhere all the time because it works, and in war you cling to what works. But the weapon's origin story teaches them discipline. Guadalcanal taught them the cost of one recovered dud. So even as production scales up and VT becomes more common, the habits of secrecy remain. Officers still watch for malfunctions with a cold seriousness. Ordnance crews still treat misfires as emergencies, and reports still avoid the kind of phrasing that would reveal the how too plainly. In the fleet, the secrecy becomes cultural. You can praise the gunnery, you can praise the director crew, you can praise the speed of the loaders, but you do not explain the special fuse to people who don't need to know, because the fewer mouths that can leak it, the longer it stays ahead. That secrecy also shapes Allied tactics in subtler ways. If you can break attacks earlier, you can keep carriers maneuvering instead of burning. You can keep radar pickets and screens intact. You can maintain operational tempo instead of spending days rescuing survivors and patching flight decks. Those are compounding advantages, the kind that don't show up as a single dramatic turning point, but slowly change the war's texture. More sorties flown, more landings supported, more pressure maintained. In the minds of sailors, VT becomes part of the ship's personality. The belief that the 5-inch 38, already respected, has become something sharper, something that can actually stop what it sees. And that belief matters in combat because it tightens discipline when fear tries to loosen it. Yet the men who were there at the beginning never forget the fragility. Helena's gunners remember the night when the first close airbursts made their hair stand up, and the officers remember the quiet tension of writing reports that could not be leaked. The secret fuse, in other words, fights two wars at once: the visible one in the sky, where aircraft break and fall, and the invisible one in paperwork and silence, where the Allies protect the explanation long enough for the results to keep piling up. If the Japanese never fully grasp why until late, it's because the Allies learned early that a miracle doesn't stay a miracle by being shouted. It stays a miracle by being used, recorded, guarded and repeated, one airburst at a time, until the enemy's confidence is shredded along with his wings. By the time the war nears its final years, the men who first watched those uncanny airbursts near Guadalcanal understand something that isn't written on any gunnery chart. The VT fuse didn't just improve accuracy, it changed the timing of survival. Before, anti-aircraft defense was often a desperate bargain with physics, a gamble that you could set a time fuse correctly in a sky full of speed, wind, and evasive movement. You could throw up impressive barrages and still watch a plane hold its line long enough to drop and kill you. After VT, the sky became less forgiving for the attacker because the shell no longer needed perfect prediction. It needed proximity, and proximity was enough to turn fragments into a scythe. That shift multiplied across fleets in ways sailors could feel even if they couldn't explain it. Raids that broke earlier, dives that wobbled into misses, torpedo runs spoiled by bursts that arrived like invisible punches, and later, the most terrifying attacks of all, suicide dives, disrupted just far enough out that the difference between a hit and a miss became the difference between a ship burning and a ship steaming onward. Yet the miracle's power was never only in electronics, it was in discipline. Every airburst that saved a ship depended on someone guarding the secret long enough for it to be used again, officers choosing when to fire and when not to, crews treating malfunctions as emergencies, commanders resisting the urge to brag, and intelligence men crafting reports that captured the truth without advertising the mechanism. That is the hidden character of the VT fuse, a weapon that demanded silence as much as it demanded steel. And if you return to that humid night on January 5, 1943, Iron Bottom Sound's black water, the uneasy hush after an alarm, the 5-inch mounts elevating as a distant engine note crept closer, you can see the war's pattern in miniature. The enemy arrives believing speed and bravery can break a ship. The ship answers with a new kind of burst that makes the air itself lethal. The attacker falters, and the crew feels the world tilt by a few degrees toward survival. The Pacific would still demand blood, and no technology would end fear, but the VT fuse gave sailors something rare in the middle of chaos, a tool that reliably turned almost into enough and near into deadly. In the end, that is the tiny miracle at Guadalcanal, proof that a small guarded idea, carried inside one shell, could protect convoys, screens, carriers, and the lives packed into their steel hulls, not with a loud turning point, but with thousands of quiet airbursts that bought the fleet time to win.